Hey guys, Sean here, and welcome to the F1 Word Podcast, episode number 2. I hope you're all well today. We've got a very juicy topic to sink our teeth into. I'm going to be joined by Stuart, aka Chamber F1, to talk about the current state of Formula One after what's been a mediocre start to 2019 so far. But before we get on to that, don't forget, if you're new, you can listen to this over on SoundCloud and Spotify, the links for which are in the description down below. But we're going to start by bringing in Stuart and saying a very good afternoon. Hello, mate. How are we doing?
Afternoon, Sean. How's it going? It's not too bad here.
Yeah, I'm ready for a good discussion. I've been a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Disenchanted. That's a good word. I like that. About Formula One this year so far. And I was a bit downbeat after Spain, so I thought it'd be a good idea to have a chat about how things are. But before I kind of go too far, I ought to ask you, really, didn't get a chance on Sunday. How was the Spanish Grand Prix for you? Did you enjoy it? Or are you one that kind of agrees it was a little bit meh?
It didn't deliver, did it? Let's be
No.
honest. I was at least hoping for Bottas to cling on to that first place, and because even if even if he'd led the race from the front, it'd have been boring from there. I'm still clinging on to Bottas giving Hamilton a run through the season, and he kind of just needs every possible win he can get to keep that going, because we know what Hamilton's like, especially once he gets momentum in the middle of the season. So, yeah, it was a bit of a letdown, wasn't it? And I always go optimistic, hoping that we're going to get something out of it, even though Mercedes turn up and seem very powerful every weekend. I just always have this hope that something's going to happen. But no, it was a bit of a nothing race, wasn't it?
Yeah, it felt like, I mean, I don't know, if doing the watch along, I didn't feel like there was a lot to get excited about. A lot of the chat were quite disappointed, a bit flat. Nobody was really interested. People switching off as well. It's not good, but I've got to do this. I have to look at this from every perspective. Is this just a typical knee-jerk post-Spanish Grand Prix reaction? Because it does feel like every single year we as fans seem to be having this conversation after Spain.
I think there's definitely an element of that, because Spain so rarely gives us a classic race or gives us something to get excited about. It's a very processional track. The teams know it inside out, so there doesn't get much variation in how they approach it. So yeah, we always sort of leave Spain feeling a bit like, oh dear, Formula One isn't where we need it to be. On the other hand, Formula One isn't where we need it to be, and Spain sort of highlights that, like, in an exaggerated format. And it doesn't help. We've had a few races on the trot this year where things haven't quite come together. And I think we're all just sort of feeling a little bit let down, because after like testing and everything, it really seemed like Ferrari were going to be among it all, and they haven't. And we've had like just Mercedes 1-2 after Mercedes 1-2, and that really wasn't what we wanted going into this season. We were really hoping for them to finally sort of, be taken to task. And Spain sort of just highlighted that they are miles ahead. So I think we've just left very disappointed. But I am hopeful that Spain isn't representative of a typical race for the rest of the year. We are only 5 races in, and there's 16 left.
I think the whole Spain thing, it's been amplified or magnified by the fact that Baku was a letdown for a lot of people, because people expected a really exciting race. I know crashes don't make a race and that kind of thing, but there wasn't a huge amount of overtaking. It was a little bit... It wasn't a bad race, Baku. It was just a bit meh. China, I think, was quite poor. Bahrain was about our only saviour so far this year, because Australia was just... How can I word this? Typical Australia. It's probably the best way to put that one, because you just... I always say with Australia, the problem is we've had 3 months without Formula One, so any race will do, and we get quite excited and then often leave going, oh, yeah, it's not that great, is it? But I think Spain was really poor. I don't... For us, for saddos, if you like us, Stuart, the strategy intrigue was there, so we enjoyed that, but that for me is not something that's going to keep fans switching on. And I've seen quite a few people actually defend Spain and say things like, oh yeah, but the last 15 laps were brilliant. Well, first of all, and of course, absolutely everyone's entitled to their opinion. That if people think it was brilliant, that's fine. That's your view. But first of all, it wasn't brilliant for that last 15 laps. It was incredible compared to what we've seen to the previous 51 laps, but we didn't really get a huge amount of overtaking or action. We got the Haas boys fighting, and Kvyat made a good move, I think, as well, or a couple of moves possibly. I'm not 100% sure on that, but there was some good racing in there. But 15 laps, that's not... That's not good enough. We shouldn't. I'm going to go on one now, but you shouldn't be tuning into Formula One, particularly now that it's moving behind a paywall and they're trying to encourage these young fans in, and they want to get as many new people involved in the sport and people to pay Sky and pay F1 TV. People aren't going to do that for 15 laps of racing.
Yeah, I mean that is that is the kicker, isn't it? And I think if you're a Formula One fan and you're like trying to, maybe you chose this year to sit your friend down and get them into it, or your sibling or your partner or your child or whatever, and you said, this is my favorite sport, let's watch 2019 together, I think this would not have sold them.
No.
I think they'd be hard pressed to sort of see why you were so into it. So they do need to kind of get their fingers into this sport and really kind of tear it apart and make actually quite a number of fundamental changes to get it back to something we're used to. And I don't think that comes from, I think, what a lot of people, I mean, I think a little bit of rose tinted glasses looking through history, maybe a little bit of a simpler approach to it. They do things like the 80s and the 90s, and it was all roaring and interesting and exciting, and there were like classic battles and stuff. And they think, just you know reset Formula One to what it was back then. I think that's too simple an approach, because you can't wind the clock back on innovation. Even if you made the rules, 1985 rules, you wouldn't get 1985 cars, because we've learned so much about aerodynamics and stuff since then. We've people would not approach race weekends in the same way. A lot of what goes into Formula One now is a lot of sort of data processing and things that fundamentally change how the cars are and how the teams approach races. So that's not the answer. So I think we need to figure out a way to move the sport forward in a way that encourages more competitiveness, and this sort of starts future proofing it against the way technology and innovation may start to sort of interrupt it again. It's quite a complicated beast now, because obviously teams are spending hundreds of millions of pounds on developing cars, and they've got huge wind tunnels and massive computers, and they've got more power to sort of get every last millisecond out of the car than they've ever had before. So building rules to protect against that is really, really hard now. And it kind of wasn't 2 decades ago, when a lot of innovations hadn't been discovered, and you had sort of teams bolting on funny wings or sticking on funny engines, or making suspension innovations that had never been seen before. We're not sort of getting that now. We're sort of in this kind of weird zone where it's all about refining these really intricate, especially around aerodynamics, the knowledge we know, and get into this sort of weird phase where the cars just can't race with each other, and we need to sort of just break that apart. I'm actually, heathen that I am, basically in favour of just standardising front and rear wings as a start.
Oh, that'll go down well. I mean, they are looking at standardised parts, aren't they? I think there's another a tender process for some new stuff that they want to get sorted before they sign off in June, and then another tender process for some smaller parts for next year, for 2021. Sorry. So, I think some standardised parts are acceptable. I will say that if it doesn't make a difference to us as fans, things like I don't know, really does a certain type of suspension really matter to us, so why not standardise it? But the things that matter, I think, need to stay kind of as they are. But I will say very quickly, a couple of last things on Barcelona. First of all, Stuart did a video on why we don't often get great races in Barcelona. Definitely worth checking out. I will pop a link in the description to this for that. But also, my final word on it, I don't know if you agree, Stuart, but for me, Barcelona can go. Get rid of it. If it's fine for testing, but it's not a racetrack. It's brilliant for MotoGP as well. I will say that. It's really good for MotoGP, but we're talking about Formula One, and it's not good for Formula One racing. It needs to go. And I also think there needs to be a rule put into place to, I guess, future-proof, actually, going to what you said, where if a track hosts testing, they cannot host a race.
I am fully in favour of that rule. I just think we should separate test tracks and race tracks. Again, there are a couple of scenarios where there's certain when it makes sense, like this week and the last week of the season, actually, when they're already at the racetrack and all the cars are already there. So it's kind of cheap for everybody to just do a few days testing there. And that's a little bit different because you're in the middle of the season. I don't know. It's tricky, isn't it? That's a good cost-saving thing to do. But yeah, I think especially 2 weeks of winter testing, the teams turn up with so much knowledge for this track, and I just think it kind of wrecks it. And I think Barcelona's not right for F1. I think some of the problem because after I made that video, there was some talk about, no, it's not the track, it's the cars. You've got to fix the cars, and then it'll work on the track. And I think there's a bit of a mixture there. And I think sometimes the way certain tracks are and the way Formula One cars aren't really compatible anymore, even if they were in the past. And I don't think, as you said, Barcelona is really that suitable for Formula One at the moment. It might be in the future if Formula One becomes something a little bit different. But yeah, and it is, fundamentally easy to change the cars than it is change the tracks. But I think you're right. Get rid of Barcelona. There are plenty of tracks vying for a place on the calendar. And as far as I'm aware, Spain are not massively interested right now. So let's move on.
They've lost the Alonso factor, haven't they? I think that's hurt them quite a bit in Barcelona. But interesting point on the cars there. But I'm trying to think just off the top of my head and on the fly. I don't think even when the cars were massively and fundamentally different 2 decades ago, we got great racing in Spain. So, like I said, I think it's brilliant. It is a really good racetrack for MotoGP, and other series it'll suit. I mean, we got some good racing in Formula 2, but for a sport like Formula 1, when the guys are doing over 1,000 laps, Williams aside, of course, in pre-season testing, that's a lot of information to then take to Spain, and it just doesn't work for me. So we'll move on, and we'll talk about what we think is wrong with Formula One. I'm going to go straight in with the first point on. I've written a list, and by a list I mean about 4 pages, but don't worry, this is not going to be a 3-hour podcast. Racing isn't exciting at the front, and Bahrain aside, the races tend to be decided pretty much by the end of lap 1. And actually, in the case of Australia, China and Spain, it was all done by the first corner. It's not close enough at the front. I don't have an issue with the team dominating, and I may be in the minority there. If Mercedes can build the best car, disappear up front, cruise to both titles, and actually be able to plan a proper race strategy, then they deserve the credit. They shouldn't be criticised for, as some people say, destroying the sport. There's nothing wrong with one team domination. It's about close racing, and I just don't think we're going to get that at the sharp end of the grid anytime soon. I don't think, at the same time, I'm going to be a hypocrite. I don't think that's Formula One. Have we ever had really long-term, Stuart, 2, 3, 4 teams fighting for a world championship? I can't ever really recall a time. Recent history.
Yeah, so I think 2010 was the last time we kind of had that. We had a bit of Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren mixing up, and we had those 4 people going into the last race as potential contenders. I think 5 people went into the second to last race, which I think that was the only time that's ever happened. But so that was quite cool, and I think going back a little bit further, 2003, we had 3 teams sort of up the sharp end almost until the very end, which was, exciting. I think also, talking about competition at the very top, we still don't have, even though Bottas has kind of stepped up his game this year, we don't have the kind of rivalry in the Mercedes camp that we had during the Nico Rosberg years, which even though we had 2014, 15, 16, domination by Mercedes, we didn't have that Ferrari kind of starting to creep in and take wins from them back then. But it was actually quite exciting because there was something between Rosberg and Hamilton, not just as characters, but on the track. They were racing, not wheel to wheel every race, but quite a few races during the season. And a lot of the time it went, if not down to the wire a couple of seasons, and like kind of rounded up a little bit early in 2015. So, we had that, and we don't have that in Mercedes. We do have it to an extent at Ferrari. The unfortunate thing is, because they're sort of a little bit behind Mercedes, their rivalry is hampering their ability to take on Mercedes, because they always seem to be pretty close on the track and having to sort out which car should be going first and not really engaging with the Mercedes. If Ferrari was the top team and Vettel and Leclerc were as close as they are this year, I think we'd be saying this season was turning out to be a bit of a classic.
Yeah, that'd be incredible, wouldn't it? So I suppose what's wrong with Formula One? I guess Ferrari strategy then. It's probably what we could throw in there as a possibility. Not trying to take a dig at Ferrari, but it feels like that seems to be the dominating factor. You've got Mercedes, 5 back-to-back 1-2s, and then the other big topic seems to be what's going on at Ferrari. So, yeah, definitely. I mean, what about you, Stuart? I've got a few things on my list that I think are wrong, but is there anything big time that you think is really wrong with the sport, or is it just a number of little things?
I think the big things are the things that we've sort of spoken about quite a few times and already touched on. I mean, again, we've got the cars are in a bit of a state at the moment. They're not able to race with each other that well, and the sort of the way the rules are structured is not allowing like smaller teams to maybe develop them and reach the top teams, and their situation with money. feeds into that as well. So I think I think maybe for a few years now we're sort of kind of hooking ourselves on all our hopes into 2021 and hoping they get that together. I think that's my sort of. I think that's the main thing that's causing, I guess, the problems with with Formula One are these cars and figuring out how to allow them to sort of freely develop them in the way that Formula One should allow, but shaping the rules and restricting them in certain ways that will not allow their development to kind of hinder the ability to race together, and not forcing them to spend like $500 million every year just to be vaguely competitive. That it's, we criticize it, but it's really hard to run the sport and get all these things in balance and get it working. We're at this sort of stage, like touching on what I said before, where like the ability to innovate and work these supercomputers to process data and blah blah blah, build these cars is so intensive and expensive and results in kind of side effects that affect the racing. It's really hard to get that all in balance and manage the sport that way. So hopefully Ross Bourne will have a handle on it and be able to make it work. But again, you've got to sort of convince the teams to go with it. So that's my main problem. I think that's the only big thing. And then there are little things after that.
Yes, it is the cars. A great shout, because it's become more of a teams championship, and drivers are reliant on the car, when for me the driver should be the one making the difference, not a really clever tiny little new front wing flap. I don't think that should be making the difference in Formula One. It should be the driver. But do you think, because I was pondering this earlier, I was sceptical after Australia about the 2019 regulations. Bahrain, I got excited about them, but when you think about it, it was all about the DRS there. China, we didn't see an awful lot of overtaking outside of DRS. The same in Baku and in Spain. I've got this horrible feeling that, not that this has ever happened before, of course, that they've got it wrong with the regulations. I don't feel that 2019 regulations have worked the way they were hoping. And the thing is, with development the way it goes in Formula One, I think they've already found most of what they lost last year because of these regulation changes, and because, without being too pessimistic, and I'm trying so hard not to be, but I feel like with development ramping up through the season and the way these teams work, it's probably going to get worse this year before it gets better, and it could well be that we're stuck with this till 2021.
It's tricky, isn't it? And I think we need to, either we or someone who is able to do this a little bit better, need to do a sort of deep dive on actually, how competitive is it compared to last year? Because we did have a dodgy China, and China's normally, it can be okay. It's got the big straights, it's got like DRS zones and enough like little twiddly bits for people to get involved with each other. And there are a number of factors going this year. I think even if the cars claw back the lap time, that doesn't necessarily mean the rules have failed, because we weren't trying to slow the cars down. We were trying to sort of reduce all this dirty air that comes off the front wings. That's what was trying to happen. And we knew the side effect would be if you simplify the front wings, the cars will probably go slower. But if they find other ways to make them go faster without causing all these sort of outwash and stuff off the front wings, then great. But I guess I'm reserving my opinion on whether or not these have completely failed. We've got some good races coming up that I'm looking forward to. Monaco may not necessarily demonstrate the best of overtaking and racing, but you never know. So I think maybe we need to look at this at the end of the season and see how much they work. So I'm hesitant to sort of say they failed yet. I do think Liberty, I think they've changed the way they approach it now, but I think they listened too much to the fans maybe when they were sort of it wasn't really necessarily Liberty back then, but like when constructing the 2017 rules, and they was all right, let's make them wider and faster and rah. And, everyone would have told them that this will make racing harder. We don't, as much as I think F1 should be the pinnacle of, single seater racing, I don't think the lap time speaks to how good it is. You could shave 6 seconds off these cars' laps and make better racing, and it'd be no less of a spectacle, because you can't see with your eyes particularly that they're 6 seconds slower. They can still be exciting. So I think that kind of that reach they did in 2017 to kind of make, I think they're aiming for 5 seconds faster, which is what they got. And yes, they were 5 seconds faster, but you kind of chopped overtaking in half overnight. So I don't think necessarily, taking that aim at Formula One, that speed is necessarily everything. was right, and I think they are rethinking that now. But unfortunately we've got to wait till 2021 for them to sort that out.
Yeah, I agree. You can slow these cars down, and you're still going to get. You can still get great racing. I completely agree. But I was more about the cars being able to follow. We don't seem to be seeing a lot of overtaking. And I was watching the onboard again before doing this of, was it Alexander Albon was behind Roman Grosjean through turn 3 in Spain. Grosjean goes flat, and because Albon's behind, he's having to slow down. He's having to back off, and that, I just wonder if they're not having the desired effect. But to be fair, again, back to the 2017 rules and with the 2019 ones, the likes of Christian Horner were all saying this isn't going to make much of a difference. This isn't going to do what they want. We need this, we need that, we need the other. And I don't think the team should have the say they have in the rules. I don't think they should be the ones to make the calls, because at the moment it feels like your manufacturers are making the calls because they've got, how can I word this in the nicest possible way? They've got liberty over a barrel, because if any of them walk away, they're going to feel like they're going to lose a lot of money and a lot of interest in the sport if a Ferrari goes, if a Mercedes goes, if a Renault goes. But I don't think they should have the say they have in the rules. Absolutely, Liberty should listen to the teams, and that's the point I'm making. They should be listening to Christian Horner when he says, look, Adrian Newey's told me this is what's going to happen. But ultimately, they can't let the teams make the decisions, which they kind of are at the moment. So I think that's also a problem and a solution all rolled into one, which is nice and confusing. But the next one on my list, and I think I speak for a lot of people when I say this, tyres. There is far too much tyre talk. I don't care if a driver can get their tyres to the end of the race. I want to know, are those tyres going to survive because Sebastian Vettel just bumped into Lewis Hamilton? That's the kind of thing you want to hear on tyres. You want to hear the exciting side of it. It shouldn't be a case of, oh, if Sebastian Vettel or Leclerc or Max Verstappen slow down by 3 seconds a lap, they should be able to get these to the end of the race. These tyres should be able to be driven flat out from start to finish. No more talk of it. I'm not interested in, people loved Formula One when we had 4 or 5 stops a race sometimes because of the high degradation tyres. No, let's give them the fuel they need. Make them have a minimum amount of fuel in as well, so they can't underfuel the cars, and just say flat out lights to flag. That is what I would love to see in Formula One, and I'm just sick of hearing. And mate, if anybody else listens to the Sky coverage, I'm sick of hearing Crofty explaining about the flipping tyres every single weekend. I'm just not interested. I know I should be, but I'm just not.
You know what? I agree with you completely. Really, I think the problem we have is that Formula One, in terms of like trying to create a spectacle, is leaning too much on the tires to kind of force that to happen. I think that was the sort of plan when Pirelli came in, and they were like, Pirelli, we want high deg tires that run out of life quickly. So there's a lot of like mixed up strategies and stuff, because they got rid of refueling, obviously. And I'm not necessarily, people have been saying for quite a while, bring back refueling, bring back refueling. It was much more exciting there. And I've sort of resisted it because I'm not really a big fan of refueling. But when you did have refueling, it wasn't, nothing was reliant on the tire life. It was just reliant on how much fuel you had in the car. So you could push as much as you wanted. You might use a bit more fuel, but you could only go as long as, the amount of fuel you had in the tank, and then you'd have to stop again. Your entire strategy was based around that. So it was like these sort of stints of sprinting in a way, or maybe doing slightly longer run if you wanted to do less pit stops. There was, when you had refueling, you could do strategy in a way that worked and was meaningful and didn't take away from the racing. And when they tried to kind of transfer all of that responsibility onto the tires, it doesn't work the same way because of how tire life works. You can either have tires like slowly degrading over time, or you have this kind of sudden cliff that drops off, which is what we sort of started with in sort of 2011, 2012. Pirelli built in this just kind of like, they just dropped suddenly and you were like 3 seconds off the pace compared to the previous lap, which had its own problems as well. So yeah, I'm not much in favor of bringing refueling back, but it did add that kind of strategic element that we can't get from the tires. And again, this is all going to come back to fixing the cars, because we are using the tires as a crutch to get the cars competitive with each other, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're hoping that people will be on slightly different strategies, or people will manage their tires slightly differently. And if Hamilton's in the lead but he's not able to work his tires as well, or is slightly better on the softs than the mediums, then Vettel will be able to out strategize him by working his tires differently. And so that's what sort of we're funneling all our hopes into. And you're right, we shouldn't have that. And I think if they fix the cars and make them able to follow each other, race side by side, push each other in the way we were sort of used to 10, 20 years ago, then we can remove the tyres from the equation. I mean, obviously we'll still have tyres, but we won't have to be thinking about them as much, and we won't have to go through all this like degradation compounds. How long do these tyres work? What was the lap time on a tyre like 20 laps in compared to 10 laps in, and so on. I think you're right. We talk about tyres way too much, and I think it's because we've been forced to, because it's the only sort of thing that's bringing an element of mystique into a race length strategy.
I'm very aware, by the way, by saying that we're not going to talk too much about tyres, or we talk too much about tyres, and now we seem to be talking a lot about tyres in this podcast, which is slightly hypocritical, I know. But if you go back to Barcelona, pre-safety car, it's exactly your point there. What was the talking point? Oh, why is Leclerc on the hards? It doesn't matter. The only thing I will say on tyres, the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to draw a line under this and move on. The one thing they've got spot on, Pirelli and F1 with tyres, is taking all three compounds to a race. I think that's brilliant because it does offer up that little bit of strategy that we enjoy. The only thing I would like to see is them giving I guess what you could call almost the equivalent to low fuel. So when they take the here we go, the C1s, the C2s, and the C3s to Barcelona, why not take the C1s, the C2s, and then the C4s? Take a grade softer than they would normally take, so that if people want to go for the equivalent of fueling low in qualifying or fueling low in the race, they can by putting on that faster tyre. Yes, it might only last 4 laps, but it might give us some excitement. But I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop on tyres because, it's not thrilling at all. We've talked about the cars as well. Something that actually very quickly I've noticed this year is TV has been very poor. Look, the midfield is phenomenal this year. It is so close. Spain is not representative of what to expect from that. They were well spread out and were always going to be in Barcelona. But prior to that, this season's been brilliant in the midfield. I think we're all kind of in agreement. I think most of us are in agreement on that one. So I've thoroughly enjoyed that battle. The problem is, TV is not picking up on that. They're too busy focusing on Mercedes, on Ferrari team orders, on Red Bull, particularly Max Verstappen. And whilst I understand from a Liberty perspective and an FOM perspective, which is the same thing, but you know what I mean, their big draw, their big selling points are the Lewis Hamiltons, they are the Max Verstappens, they are the Sebastian Vettel, so they're going to focus on them. But when you've got Lewis Hamilton disappeared and Sebastian Vettel not doing much apart from not letting his teammate through and vice versa with Leclerc, Max Verstappen trying to stay ahead of him or trying to get sort of a second back or 3 seconds up the road, if there's nothing really happening there, go back and look into that midfield. Even if the only action on track is Robert Kubica trying to pass George Russell for 19th place, that's racing. We need to be seeing that rather than, with all due respect to Ferrari fans, 17 slow-mo replays of Sebastian Vettel locking up into a hairpin.
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't fault you. And it's the oddest thing about it is I thought this was something we'd gotten over. Like there were definitely some dark years when the cameras were firmly fixed at the front end of the race, and we never got to see what happened in the midfield. But I feel like the last few years they'd learned and developed their coverage so that we were looking at the midfield more. And actually, I think we commented like last year particularly about how there wasn't much going on at the front, so we were looking at the midfield a lot more and talking a lot about the midfield and is that right, is that wrong? But we were, the directors had noticed that all the action was happening in the midfield, so we got to see a lot of what was happening with the Force Indias and the Salvas and all that sort of going head to head.
That was a Bernie thing though, wasn't it? But I'm sure Bernie used to say, or there was a rumour that Bernie used to sort of say, if your team's going to disappear up front and not give us lots of action, we won't focus on you and your sponsors won't get the airtime. I don't know if that's true, but I can imagine Bernie saying that.
That is exactly the kind of thing Bernie would say, whether he implemented it or not. But yeah, and it's this year, it's like they've revised their sort of, whatever sort of code of operations they give to the directors, and when we've not been sort of looking at things. And was it China or I can't remember which race it was where Albon sort of came from the pit lane and ended up
China.
Like, 6th or something, and we were like, where? Why didn't we see any of that? And there's lots of races where someone is suddenly like in the points, and it's like we haven't seen any of this, particularly when, as you say, there's not much happening up front. We're not, and it's not that nothing can happen up front, but sometimes it takes a long while for that to happen. If Bottas is 6 seconds behind Hamilton and reeling him in at 0.2 a lap, then we can look at something else until he gets a bit closer. So I don't know what's going on there. They do seem to be listening a little more to us as fans. So hopefully they're taking it in. Maybe they will have new people there. We'll have to check that out. But fingers crossed this won't last for long. I'm kind of optimistic that they'll sort this out, because I think people will notice that that we're missing a lot of what's happening through the field. And I think more than ever, it may be a social media bubble that we're sort of in, but we're seeing people, much more interested in the midfield teams than we used to. I think maybe because we have been looking at them for 2 years, and we want to see what's happening between Haas and Renault, or we want to see what's happening between the McLaren teammates, because they seem to be in a bit of a battle this year. So yeah, I'm looking forward to them sort of responding to that and showing us a bit more about what's going on.
Sorry, totally random point I wasn't going to make, but and I didn't even think about making. But especially after the Netflix documentary, you think that Liberty as a business would think a lot of people were into that Renault fight, a lot of people were into that Haas battle, what was happening at Force India and what is now Racing Point. Let's focus on that. Yeah, and on China, I still think, and I don't know if I'm in the minority and if you agree, Stuart, but I still think China would have felt like a better Grand Prix as a fan if we'd seen Albon coming through the field, Kimi Raikkonen doing what Kimi Raikkonen does with his overtaking and action. Now, I think that really was a lot of China's problem. Don't get me wrong, it wouldn't have been an epic, phenomenal, amazing 1000th race, but it would have been a lot better than it felt because of that TV coverage. I don't know if you agree, Stuart, or disagree.
Yeah, I think we'd have left a bit more G'd up, like we'd seen
Yeah.
some exciting things. And actually, Albon is an exciting rookie, and I think you want to F1 benefits from people talking about him and getting excited about him and thinking, oh, he really should get a Red Bull seat sometime soon, or whatever. Like we have in the last few years, we have got a lot out of looking at these young drivers and these rookie drivers, and even though they're in Saubers or BMWs, Williams or whatever, they've given us something to get excited about. Like Leclerc, if the TV coverage had been sort of similar this last year that it has been this year, we might not have sort of seen the most of Leclerc and been able to get really excited about him and what he was doing.
Yeah, Leclerc versus Alonso last year. They always seem to be together on track. That was brilliant. But anything you'd like to add to the what's wrong, the negative list, Stuart, before we try and put a positive spin on all of this and solve all of F1's problems in about 15 minutes on a Friday afternoon?
Well, I had a sort of list of good things and bad things, and one of them sort of straddled both. I think there's something interesting about tracks. I think that sort of there's good things and bad things going on, and the bad things I think, and this has been a thing I thought for a long time. I think Herman Tilke is relied upon too much. He's the sort of resident F1 track architect who tends to both make all the new tracks. I think his first one was Malaysia, but he's done Malaysia, China, Bahrain, the USA, just Vietnam, India, all the new fancy ones that have come up, Abu Dhabi. And, as you can see that he's sort of learning from like every time he makes a new one. Like if he does a good thing, then it'll appear in every single track he makes. I think the first good thing he did was Turkey's Turn 8, and there's a Turkey Turn 8 in every track he makes now. And I think he put like the sort of Maggotts Beckett style S-bend into Kota, and now that's in every sort of drawing he draws up. Every time someone responds positively to one of his tracks, he sort of sticks those bits in every track. And I think he's really, really good at making like fancy paddocks and hospitality sections and stuff. But I think just bring in some new blood, just get some different like track philosophies in, just bring new people in, so we don't have just like Tilke tracks like for half of the season. I mean, I think he's talented and does a lot of things that Formula One needs, but just sort of bring in other people and play with it more, and just go to existing tracks more would be my other thing. Just if we're going to go to Zandvoort, which we are, I'm sure Tilke will have a little bit of tink and make the paddock just like luxurious and whatever. But if you're going to modify the track, bring in someone else to do it. They did it with Silverstone. He didn't do the Silverstone modifications, and they're actually pretty cool. Yeah, so that's sort of my other main thing. And
I
also
more
think
variation kind of thing. Just a bit more variety.
That's sort of what I'm hoping for, and Liberty are very clearly courting a lot of countries right now for new tracks. Some of them street tracks, unfortunately. I think street tracks can be fun, and Baku has shown that. And Singapore actually can be quite fun, especially has that weird endurance element, and drivers start to like lose their minds about an hour and a half into it. But I think that's the other thing as well, is that Liberty have sort of eyeing up all these fancy street locations, and it's really hard to get that right for Formula One. They struggle enough with the massive wide tracks. So I think Liberty. I don't hate Liberty. I know a lot of people hate Liberty. I think sometimes they are doing things for the right reasons, and I think sometimes they're sort of following the money and making decisions for those reasons. And I think they have to. That's part of their job. But I think they just need to be careful about the decisions they're making, because not all of them are sort of to the benefit of the sport.
Yeah, they've got. With Liberty, I feel like they've got good intentions. Is kind of how
Yes.
I look at it. I think they've got good intentions, and maybe they're not getting things right, but they're trying to, which is a start. Let's not forget they've got a lot to clean up that was left behind by Bernie. You know, for example, the pay TV thing. They've got that to sort out, and the revenue distribution, the money distribution F1 is ridiculously stupid. It really is, and I really hope that gets sorted. They've got a lot to sort out, and they've also, at the same time, without, well, basically slagging us off, Stuart, they've also got a very loyal and passionate fan base to fight against as well for some of the changes they want to push through. So I think they've got good intentions, and
I do. I prefer them to Bernie. That may be heathenist to a lot of people, but I have a lot of opinions about Bernie, and I will make a video about that at some point. But yeah, I think they are going to be better stewards to the sport than he was.
Yeah, I'd agree. And on the tracks, by the way, I think Morocco is the latest one to be rumoured. I think I don't know if that's going to be a track or a street track. I know they race. I hope my geography's right here. I know they race in Marrakesh, don't they, for Formula E? So I don't know if it's a street track or a proper purpose-built Tilkedrome we're looking at.
I would imagine it'd be more likely to be a racetrack than on the streets, but you're not really sure yet. But I think that would be interesting. We haven't had a race in Africa for a while, and it is a huge geographical landmark on the world. So it would be good to have at least one race there. You know, we might head to South Africa soon. You never know. It'd be interesting it's going to be interesting over the next few years to find out what conversations Liberty have been having around the world and what starts propping up. And as we've seen, not all of them are sort of able to fall into place. I think Miami's looking for even more precarious. I don't know if I'll ever appear. But, you know, I think we're going to see more and more tracks sort of making appearances and some old ones being swapped out. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think having the calendar changing and evolving year on year is a good thing, as long as we get good tracks and good races, because it is a world championship and we should be sort of going around the world a little bit.
See, Miami kind of reminds me of, was it New Jersey that Bernie tried to bring in?
Yeah.
He could, and that, you know, it was all pretty much confirmed, but then never got through what it needed to get through. It kind of reminds me of that, but we'll move on from that. Positive spins then, Stuart. What needs to be sorted? What needs to be changed in Formula One? I have a short answer, which is a lot. A lot needs to be changed quite quickly. But I think, first of all, the cars, they've got to be simplified. The aero's got to be simplified further for 2021, which is hopefully what they're going to target to do. Possibly ground effects, a lot they're coming back in some form as well. So that should help to close up the midfield. I think that will go... It's not going to solve all of F1's problems. I think they run a lot deeper than that, but that would be a really good starting point. And if they just close up the field as well, sort out this distribution of money, I think that's going to be important. This cost cap will be massively helpful as well. But what I do want to say on the cost cap is some, I don't know if concerning is the right word, but just something to bear in mind. I can't remember who it was. It could have been Gunther Steiner, or it might have been Otmar Safnauer, so Haas or Racing Point, are already saying that this proposed cost cap that's coming in, they're not going to be able to max that out because they haven't got the money to be able to max that out, which potentially still means that your haves are going to have the advantage over the have-nots. So the cost cap is a good idea, and I think in principle it could work, but number one, it still looks like those that have got the money are going to be able to spend it, and those that haven't aren't, which is the most obvious statement I've probably ever made in my life. But also policing it, I'm not convinced it's going to be easy, because you've got Red Bull with 2 teams, you've got Ferrari, you've got an interest, let's put it that way, in 3, including their own team, of course. So it's not going to be easy for them, but it's also not going to be impossible for them to pool their resources to get around parts of these rules.
Yeah, I mean, that last point is, I think, one of the trickiest things to manage when you've got a cost cap in. You know, if Ferrari and Alfa Romeo work together and the resources end up sort of flowing in one direction, that is a problem. And I think the matter of policing it is maybe a like a longer and different conversation for the other day. I don't think that should detract from the benefits of having that cost cap. And I think also, even if you know, in the next few years, certain, you know, lower budget teams like Haas won't spend as much as the cost cap allows them to, it should, you know, in theory, should it work, it should bring the competition closer together. So, Haas, for example, could make more of an impact with the money they do have, maybe move up the field, maybe put themselves in a position to get more lucrative sponsorship and spend a bit more money. I think as long as the budgets are closer together, then that's good, even if people are spending different amounts, within that cap, which I think will be inevitable. I don't think everybody will be maxing out that cap. But as long as they're close together, as long as Haas are spending a third of what Ferrari are spending,
Yeah.
then we're in better ground. If they're spending 90% of what Ferrari is spending, then we're sort of we're talking closer together, and we are. I think there's a big complication around getting that cost cap to work and getting it to, I think it's very easy to say you can only spend X amount of pounds a year. Is another story to be like, well, how does this actually work? What can they spend it on? What do they do if they can only spend like £500 million, but they make £700 million in sponsorship deals and stuff? What do they do? There's a lot of questions about how that's spent, how that's checked, and things. But that's not for us to decide. I think that the fundamental nature of a cost cap is a good thing.
Oh yeah. I sort of, to look at the other side of my argument, if you like, or the point I was trying to make is, it kind of depends on the cost cap. Again, I don't want to get too much into this, but if it's the figures we've heard are 250 million, 200 million, 150, there's all sorts, maybe starting higher and reducing to 150 million. In the long term, if you look at, say, this season, I don't know what the figures are, but let's say this season Haas spend $100 million and Ferrari spend 400 million, and then in 2023 they get the cost cap down and Haas are still spending 100 million. Ferrari can only spend 150 million. And that's kind of the point you've just made there, Stuart, but that's kind of the other side to the argument, isn't it? Is that they will be closer. So I hope that can work, but definitely a cost cap. And kind of sticking with cost, I think these power units need to be simplified. They need to be cheaper. But unfortunately, because, again, going back to what we're saying about teams shouldn't be making the rules, because a couple of teams threw their toys out the pram, it doesn't look like we're going to get any change to the power units. So they're going to be just as expensive and just as complicated, meaning we're stuck with them, which I'm not really anti-hybrid era. I don't think it's been awful. I've got the sound you kind of get used to. No, it's not the sound of a roaring V8 or a roaring V10, but the sound you get used to, and they are quick, which is important. But I think Martin Brundle made a lot of excellent points in his column in Sky on Monday, I think it was. He made a couple that were ridiculous, but he made a couple of really good points. And F1
Classic.
should be F1 should be entertainment first. And so should they be thinking, well, we need to keep these hybrid for road relevance, or do they just go, right, lads, we're taking these back to V8s? I mean, I think they should stick with what they've got, but there are a lot of people that will be in the comments now on YouTube going, no, bring back V10s, bring back V10s. But it's like you said earlier, progress can't be undone, can it? Or it can't seem to be.
No, I think, I'm very pro-hybrid, especially as I think no matter how much you like V10s and how much you like combustion engines, they're not going to be around forever. And we, long term, we're going to need to start thinking about like other forms of power unit, however they work. That's your one thing. Otherwise you're sort of clinging on to grim death with the V10s or the V8s, whatever. And I'm pro-hybrid. I think there has been a major, as you say, with the costs of them. They've been so expensive because they're so complicated, because they're so new and using cutting edge technology, whereas old sort of V-style combustion engines without any turbos or anything are actually quite simple technology, and has sort of been refined and not as prohibitively expensive. But and again, kind of like with everything we're saying, it's sort of like, this is a good concept on paper, but how do we make it work? Hopefully, and I'm with you in that they probably would simplify them a bit more, maybe take out the MGU-H and stuff like that, and just pare them back a little bit. But hopefully, not changing them means the sort of development side of them will not be as prohibitive as they might be if you did change them, because they've already got a sort of solid base there. They did have to take away the the engine freeze, the sort of the credit-based engine freeze, where you weren't allowed to develop the engines as much, which I think was, the whole point of that sort of freezing development, or at least restricting development quite a lot, was for cost-cutting measures. So it's eventually reached a point where everyone was not changing their engine year on year. But because the engines, when we started the hybrid era, were so far apart from each other, they sort of got rid of that in a hope to sort of squeeze them all up. And maybe we'll get to a point where they're all kind of much for muchness, and then they'll just say, okay, stop developing them for the next 2 years, which worked fine in previous eras. We had like parts of the V10 era and parts of the V8 era where they just froze the engines and was like, this is your engine for the next 3 years. And because they weren't so complicated and far apart, that worked just fine and nobody really cared. I don't know what the exact solution is to this, because it is causing a lot of problems. They are expensive, and it's also putting off new manufacturers coming in.
I was just going to say, if you look at Honda, that engine freeze really screwed them over, didn't it, initially?
Yeah, it did. And I think, Honda having an awful time of it really, really put off, I think probably more than anything, other manufacturers coming in, like, oh God, we don't want to embarrass ourselves like that. Like, is this how hard it is to sort of make an engine that works in F1? I don't think anyone's admitted that, but I think people looking in from the outside be like, because I think, before Formula One, Honda were like actually quite renowned for the sort of cutting edge hybrid engines, and now I think their reputation took a bit of a hit.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. We'll not keep going about engine. We're kind of, I think we're in agreement that we know something needs to change, but we're not really quite sure what needs to change on the power unit side of things. But I've kind of, it's really complicated. But I've gone through a few bits on my list. But before I do want to finish this in a bit and just do like a very quick, let's look at what positives there are in Formula One at the moment. But before we get to that, just what changes do you think need to come into force ASAP? I know we've got 2021 coming up and there are going to be big changes, but what would you do if you had complete control of this sport to sort out what a lot of people are calling a bit of a mess?
Well, I say so. A couple of things. The cars are too big. I think just shrink them down a bit again, and too complicated. I know some people wince at the idea of this. I would standardize quite a few of the parts of the cars, and probably the wings as well, because the wings are not only super expensive but super complicated, and especially that front wing is causing so many problems. You could do so much with the rest of the car, but even if you standardize things like a front wing, so I'd start with things like that. It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, we're going to tread over old ground. The money situation needs to be sorted, but there's so many good ingredients in Formula One, and they just need to be given the right platform to just work.
A bit of TLC.
Yeah, I feel like we're not a million miles away from F1 being amazing. We just, a few things are just sort of in the way.
I also feel, we talk about TV, the TV coverage would make things better. I think if Ferrari pulled the finger out the backside and sorted out the strategies, I think they'd be a lot closer to Mercedes. I'm not saying they would have split them, Bahrain, if they built a reliable car, they would have won that one. And if Vettel hadn't had his spin, that would have been potentially a 1-2. So I think the pace is there in that Ferrari. And if they can get their strategy right and get their car to the end of these Grand Prix, then they can challenge. So it can get interesting. So I think it feels worse than it actually is. And I go back to that earlier point right at the start about, this post-Barcelona mood that we all seem to get into. I think as well, because we know Monaco's next, and Monaco is either going to be absolutely terrible or one of the greatest things you've ever witnessed in your life, especially if it rains. So we kind of get a little bit like, oh, it could be Canada before we see a really good race. And let's not talk about 2018, but I think it probably feels worse than it actually does because of what am I trying to say? If those results didn't read 5 Mercedes 1-2s, and let's say Vettel had finished second in Australia to Bottas, Mercedes has still won all 5 Grand Prix, but you'd had Verstappen maybe second in China and Leclerc up there in Bahrain, in Azerbaijan, and Ferrari had won in Bahrain. I think people will be looking at this season very differently. But from a casual fan's perspective, and that's not a knock. There are casual fans and there are those that are going to watch every single bit of a race weekend. But from a casual fan's perspective, seeing 5 1-2s in a row and then tuning in to hear Crofty go, can he get those hard tyres to the end, is not going to get people excited about Formula One. So
I think you're right.
There's a lot that needs to change, but I tend to agree with what you're saying. I don't think there's any one big thing that needs to change, and I don't even think that one big change on one part of these cars is going to solve every problem. I think a lot of tweaks need to be made. The money, Ferrari, I'm not knocking Ferrari. I'm trying not to in this video. It's very difficult with how they've started the season strategy-wise, but I have to make this point. They should not be making more money from championship revenue side of things than Mercedes. Ferrari haven't won a world championship since 2008. Mercedes have won 5 on the bounce, yet Ferrari still take home more money from the FIA. That's ridiculous. That money, and I hope it's addressed. There is talk that it's going to get reduced, but I think it should be taken away. I know that won't go down well with Ferrari fans, but that money could be taken away and split between all teams, and I think that would be much better and just make F1 more of a level playing field financially, and sort out the aero on these cars. And I genuinely think you'd probably find the rest would fall into place if they just got those 2 things right. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't. I don't think it needs too much. I think also kind of based on your sort of original points in what you just said, and like actually, as you sort of said previously, you can't knock Mercedes for doing a good job. They've done
No.
a great job. They deserve, but they've had some really error-free races. Like their first 5 races have been fairly mistake-free, to be fair. So there's like no room for anyone else to make a mistake. And Ferrari have made some mistakes. Red Bull maybe not quite there yet. You know, as soon as Ferrari have a problem, they have no chance of catching Mercedes because they're not making any mistakes. They haven't sort of tripped up. They haven't made strategy mistakes. They're not sort of running wide or sort of making sort of driving errors. They've really left very little margin for error for anyone else to sort of get in there. And so maybe that will come. I don't think we can have 21 error-free races in on the bounce, but because they're so bulletproof, it's incredibly tricky for particularly Ferrari, I guess, who are their only real competition, to sort of get in there. Ferrari, and that's on Ferrari, like you say, that's on Ferrari to not make mistakes, to outwit them in strategy, to get their car set up and not be fooled on a Friday by whatever pace Mercedes are doing. It's up to them to step up and do the better job.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to do a proper old school F1 word style rant on this at some point. But all these people that are saying that Mercedes are ruining the sport, if you want to target your anger at anybody, target at Ferrari and Red Bull for not being closer. That's it. At the end of the day, you can blame Mercedes all you want. They're doing a great job. The thing with Mercedes, very quickly, is they've got an entire team that all pull in the same direction, and Ferrari haven't, and that's the problem. And that needs to change. So I'm not going to slate Mercedes for it. Would I like to see them plummet back down the grid for the rest of the season so we get some excitement? Of course I would, but that's nothing against Mercedes. That would be the same if Ferrari were dominating, or dare I say McLaren dominating. But let's end this in as positive a way as we can, Stuart, and as quickly as we can, I guess, because I don't want this to run on for... I could sit here all afternoon talking about the problems of F1, but what's F1 got right? What is good in F1 at the moment? What is a reason to keep watching?
My number one point on that is that we have a lot of good, exciting drivers in the field, and we've got good drivers at the front. Hamilton, Bottas this year is great. Vettel is still exciting, even if he's maybe not the Sebastian Vettel of 9 years ago. Leclerc and Verstappen, great drivers, and then we've got some good drivers in the midfield. And we're like, they could be going places. We've got Sainz and Perez and. I guess Ricardo's a sort of midfield guy. He's having a bit of a funny year, but they've got a lot of potential, and some the last few years the rookies that are coming in are really top notch. We've got Leclerc, Russell, Norris, Albon, potentially Gasly. It's sort of having a bit of a rough one this year, but I wouldn't write him off. So this partly makes it a little bit more frustrating that the sort of competition is so broken. I guess there's only a few teams who have the ability to win, so you've got all these great drivers and only a couple of them can get sort of winning drives. I have to say, and I know we sort of winced. I know I winced about it when they sort of changed the super license rules to make them strict. But what we're seeing is only young drivers who have sort of proved themselves by succeeding in formula that's closer to Formula One are getting into Formula One. We're not getting sort of paid drivers that don't really belong there as much. And so we've now got sort of a very competitive field in terms of like driver skill, and a very competitive sort of waiting list as well. We've got too many. We're now aware of all these really good drivers that are clawing for seats. We've got Ocon sitting on the sidelines, for example. So I think that's great and exciting. And if the cameras showed the midfield more, we'd see more of that, because I think there's a good bunch of drivers out there, and I really, really seeing and excited about how those careers will progress, especially as when the top people, the older people, start to move on.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm loving some of the young drivers in F1 this year. They've been brilliant. Lando Norris has been really good. Alex Albon has been a surprise, and I think George Russell's doing about the best he can in that Williams. So I think, I like that point. It's a really good point. I did a 7 reasons to keep watching F1 pre-Barcelona. I wouldn't have been doing that post-Barcelona with the way I was feeling on Monday, that's for sure. But yeah, no, I think if Bottas can keep this fight up with Hamilton, we could have a Rosberg-Hamilton situation. I agree with what Stuart said earlier. It's not at that level of rivalry, but if they're fighting for a championship, it could get quite toxic. You never know, that could change, so that could get interesting. We've got, can Leclerc take it to Vettel? What can Verstappen do? Can Red Bull get ahead of Ferrari? But primarily for me, even if none of that happens and we get Hamilton disappearing with the championship or Bottas disappearing with it, Mercedes cruise to both titles, Red Bull end up just cut adrift in third, Ferrari cut adrift in second, that midfield is going to be brilliant all season, and it's going to develop. And we've had 5 races And I would argue that we've seen 3, maybe 4 different teams as best of the rest in that time at each weekend. So I'm really looking forward to watching that. So if Formula One as a whole ends up being a bit of a bore fest for people this year, certainly tune into Formula 1.5, because that is going to be great. And I think they've got that spot on this year. I know it's part of the rule changes and also just part of people catching each other. I love that battle in the midfield. I really, really do. So definitely worth keep watching for that. But I think the sport, like I said earlier, I think it's. I agree with Stuart. It's not far off where it needs to be, but a couple of tweaks could just get us there, and hopefully 2021 will be that catalyst for getting Formula One back to rose-tinted spectacles on the amazing show that it always was. Because we never had boring races in the 90s and the early 2000s, did we, Stuart? They were always 100 overtakes a race. Oh, incredible!
I think we're whatever the opposite of rose-tinted glasses. I think having those 5 Mercedes 1-2s on the bounce has maybe shifted our perspective on what this season is. And I think, those 5 1-2s have put Mercedes in a position that's going to make them very hard to beat in terms of the championship. But I think because of mistakes by Ferrari and because Red Bull are still building themselves up, we might see, optimistic face, we might see something different developing over the rest of the season. I don't think every race going forward will be like these 5 races, but I think the way things have happened to have played out have made us think maybe this season is worse than it is, particularly, like you say, off the back of Spain. It gives us a real negative vibe because Spain is often rubbish. So, as we said, I don't think we're too far off something being good. And I think we might not even have to wait till 2021 for something dramatically different. 2020, we could have a Ferrari who get themselves all pointed in the right direction. We could have a Red Bull who have got themselves in harmony with that Honda engine. I mean, these are the kind of things we said at the beginning of this season, but it's not a pipe dream to have that happen, but they do need to defeat this incredibly strong, incredibly mistake-free Mercedes.
I will add as well 2 things. Absolutely agree, but I will add just 2 things as well. First of all, yeah, okay, we're a quarter of a way into the season, but there are still 16 to go, as we touched on earlier, so you never know. I'm clutching at some straws there, but you never know. But the other thing I will say, ultimately, and I think we're probably going to be in agreement here, I know there'll be some in the comments that will say, oh no, I'm switching off. Whatever happens, we're still going to watch, aren't we, Stuart? At the end of the day, we love this sport too much, and we've invested too much time in it to walk away over an average start to the season. So I think that's it. People are switching off though. The viewing figures aren't good, but the viewing figures were never going to be good in the UK this year, because you're going to lose your 2 to 4 million that tune into Channel 4 for the live races. So we'll see. Long way to go this season yet. I am desperate to clutch at straws, but we're going to leave it there. We're going to do some questions, so apologies if you did send a couple of questions in. What I might do is maybe go live at some point and just do a Q&A and get through some questions, because loads have been coming in at the start of the season, and I don't want to keep... This podcast could go on forever talking about Formula One and what needs to be sorted, but thank you very much, as always, Stuart, for coming along. It's been a pleasure, and it was nice to just... it didn't get as ranty as I feared it might get from my side, but it was nice to just sit and chat to somebody other than my parrot about the problems in Formula One.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's good to get things off your chest, but I think it's always worth looking on the optimistic side as well and just sort of trying to get something out of it and hope for the future. I don't think the season is a write-off. I think there's good and exciting races to come, but I think we're still going to get the occasional Spain this year. But yeah, great to chat to you. I'm sure we'll be back again for more of the same.
Yeah, definitely. Monaco next, so hopefully we'll get a good one. But yeah, thank you very much, mate, and I'm sure I'll talk to you shortly.
I'll be doing a rain dance.
We need it. Yes, thank you very much to Stuart. A rain dance, that could be interesting. Thank you to you guys as well for tuning in. Don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube and you prefer, you can watch, or you can listen. You can't watch over on Spotify, not yet anyway. You can listen over on Spotify and on SoundCloud. Links are in the description. Now, I will be back next week with some more content. Going to take a couple of days off, a few family things to go through this weekend. So yes, we'll be focusing on that, but we'll be back next week with more content, building up to the Monaco Grand Prix. As Stuart said, let's all do a rain dance, and hopefully we'll get a thriller in Monaco. I know crashes don't make thrilling races, and it shouldn't be about that, but we could do with a really good race after what's been a difficult start to the season. But don't forget, you can follow me for random Twitter ramblings and all sorts over on social media. Links to Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and of course to Discord are all in the description down below. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean. This has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye.